The scripture for today comes from Joel chapter 2, verses 23 through 32. O children of Zion, be glad and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given the early rain for your vindication. He has poured down for you abundant rain, the early and the late rain as before. The threshing floors shall be full of grain, the vats shall overflow with wine and oil. I will repay you for the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, my great army that I sent against you. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you. And my people shall never again be put to shame. You shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I, the Lord, am your God, and there is no other. And my people shall never again be put to shame. Then afterward I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female slaves in those days I will pour out my spirit. I will show portents in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and the terrible day of the Lord comes. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved, for in Mount Zion and Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said, and among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord calls. Please stand.
Would you pray with me, please? May the words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. We've all heard it said, it's a God thing. And we often say that when something really remarkable happens. Like in Rockford, Michigan, when a 17-year-old girl who'd been missing for 6 weeks had been found. One Sunday in July of 2024, a mother was taking her kids to church, and she noticed a young girl on a bike. And that young girl just happened to look up at that time, and she recognized that she looked very much like a missing teenage girl, and that later was confirmed. And the woman later said, you know, I honestly feel like it was a God thing, that we passed her at that particular time, that she even looked up when she did, and that we made eye contact, and I saw her face. It was like God wanted me to be there. We've all likely used that phrase, it's a God thing. You might hear someone when someone's unexpectedly recovers from a terrible illness, or a job opportunity just happens to land in somebody's lap and it comes out of nowhere just when it's needed. A disaster is avoided at the last possible second. But what about when life doesn't go that way? The illness doesn't get better, that job offer, well, it doesn't come, and disaster does strike. It's plausible that during those times, we aren't exactly thinking, well, it's a God thing. In fact, we're not even thinking it's a good thing. At the very least, we're asking God, why? Why me, and why this? And why this right now? Kind of like a line from my favorite musical, The Fiddler on the Roof, when Tevye is expressing his frustration with God, who he says seems to be causing all of his misfortunes. Have any of you seen that musical? And anyway, he says, you know, God, did you have to make my poor horse lose his shoe just before the Sabbath? That wasn't nice. It's enough to pick on me and bless me with 5 daughters and a life of poverty, but what have you got against my horse? Sometimes, Tevi says, I think when things are too quiet up there, you say to yourself, let's see what kind of mischief I can play on my friend Tevi. Sometimes, like Tevi, we wonder. In fact, if we take stock of just the past few years, there's enough fodder to kind of make our heads swim. And, you know, we've lived through a global pandemic, and life was upended as we knew it. Natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes and wildfires have forced evacuations. They've destroyed property and even killed people, wars, economic uncertainty, and then there's those personal struggles. The prophet Joel in our text today is tasked with responding to some catastrophic events that have had his country in despair. They're living through some pretty hard times, so Joel's addressing this question of hard times and hope. And he's speaking to people who've seen the devastation of locusts and the destroying of their crops. The land's been left dry and barren, and life has been really, really hard because those locusts didn't leave anything. But then something amazing happens, and Joel now points to restoration with an exciting word from the Lord. Be glad and rejoice. New days are coming. And so then Joel refers to the recent rains, the threshing floors that are full of grain, the vats that are overflowing with oil and wine. And so there's joy again. And at this juncture, you know, it's easy to say, hey, it's a God thing. But where was God when the cutting locusts were devouring that land? If we only call good things God things, does that mean that God's absent in hard times? What if we've been looking at this phrase kind of upside down? What if a God thing isn't just about what happens to us, but about what happens in us when we walk in hope and by faith? Because biblically speaking, faith doesn't mean everything happens for a divine reason. Faith means we can find reason, hope, and strength because God is with us. That as our text says, you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel and that I, the Lord, am your God, and there is no other. This is what the prophet Joel is trying to teach us. Joel is speaking to a people who've lived through disaster. They've seen their crops fail. They've known hunger, loss, and fear. But now Joel says, rejoice, because restoration's coming. And here's the key. Amidst all of it, the terrible times and the blessings, their faith is what makes it a God thing, not the circumstances or the outcome. It's their faith that makes it a God thing. So from Joel, we kind of learn that with God's help, even in our hardest moments, we can become a part of something greater and that there are greater things to come. Joel's people knew suffering, but before this moment of joy, they'd endured all kinds of things. Chapter 1 tells us what the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten, and what the hopping locust left, this destroying locust has eaten. Their crops had been wiped out. Their land had been stripped bare, and their joy had turned to mourning. But the people of Israel understood that even this was a God thing. When the locusts devoured their fields, it was a God thing. When drought gripped the land, it was a God thing. When enemy armies ravaged their towns, it was a God thing because they had faith and hope in God. They recognized that God wasn't just in the restoration, but God was also with them in the ruin. And that's a difficult truth for us to accept even today, because we live in a world that explains all the hardships and hard stuff away. We just kind of explain it away. Well, you know, it was meant to be. We attribute our misfortunes to disasters and natural causes, I don't know, the market, human error, or even just plain old bad luck. And yet Scripture tells us that God is sovereign over all things. Does that mean that God causes our suffering? Absolutely not. But it does mean that God is present in it, that God is working through it and redeeming it, perhaps for reasons only known to God, and that only God can know. We can't always see what's going to unfold after something happens. But by faith, we can know that God is at work and that God will redeem the redeemable. Paul said in Romans 8, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose. Paul reminds us that God's at work not just in the good things, but in all things. And so that we call this the providence of God. And it's that theological concept that it's been, well, probably debated over centuries. But the concept of that providence of God refers to the belief that God is actively involved in the world, in our lives, guiding, sustaining, and caring for God's creation and for us. It means that God's present not only in moments of blessing and restoration, but also in those moments of hardship and ruin. Throughout history, theologians have discussed and interpreted what it means for God to be sovereign and how God's guidance works, especially in the midst of suffering or setbacks. But this idea, God's sovereignty and providence, encourages us to trust that even when things are difficult, confusing, that God's at work, maybe behind the scenes for purposes that are sometimes beyond our understanding. Sometimes I look at what's going on in the world and I say, why, Lord, why? How long? How long? Why in the world this? But I have to remember that God is working in the midst of all of it, and I don't know and I don't always see what God knows and God sees. So it is that belief that God is in all things and that God is going to take care of all things. Today, perhaps it's harder to believe this when life is difficult, but still we rightly cling to that idea that God is not just in our moments of blessing, rather God is in everything. John Lennon famously said, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. But it's also what happens when you're enduring life's blows, or when you're sitting in a traffic jam, lying in bed sick, waiting out bad weather, or contemplating what the locusts have eaten out of your life. In other words, life happens not just in our productive hours and fun times, but in all the times. And I know how challenging it can be to embrace and accept a God in all things perspective during difficult times, yet the belief remains that God's sovereignty applies not only in moments of success, but in all of life. And from this perspective, well, then everything is a God thing. And the ancient Hebrews, they got that. They knew that there were two ways to respond, that God is in control of everything or God's in control of nothing. We've already talked about that first option, but the other option says no, it's not a God thing. Instead, life just happens on a whim and a fancy. And we hear this a lot. It's kind of a fatalism or a determinalism, if you will. We get sick, we have accidents, we passed over promotions, our home's destroyed in an earthquake, and we just say, well, stuff happens. It is what it is. And that's one way to look at it, and I suppose a lot of people do. However, from a Christian perspective, and from Joel's perspective, it's our faith that makes it a God thing. So sure, without faith, life is what it is, stuff happens, and life is just that. But from a faith perspective, we trust God in the trials. And we're those who cling to God amidst the good and the bad. When the rains don't come, we still trust God. When the locusts devour our crops, we still believe in God. When hardships arise, we still hold on to faith in God because we know that God is always at work. And we know that what looks like devastation may be preparation for something that we can't see, that feels like a loss might be some paving a way for something even greater. We recognize that hidden amidst the rubble of our setbacks, opportunity can arise, and we trust that God is always at work in our lives. So what makes something a God thing? It's a God thing when we by faith experience peace in the middle of a storm. And that might be a personal storm. Or it is a God thing when we find the strength to keep going, even when it makes no sense. When we can look back and see how God carried us through the toughest of times and discover purpose maybe in our pain. The real miracle isn't found in when our circumstances change. It is when we change because of our faith in God. So we can say God is in all things, meaning God's present in our suffering as well as our joy, and that God can redeem the hardest moments for greater glory. So instead of asking sometimes, why is this happening? We can ask God, how will you use this? We can live with a perspective that's rooted in faith and in the hope, the blessed assurance that our God is a redemptive God. So the next time we hear someone say, well, it's a God thing, let's remember that it's not just when the blessings come. It's not just when the healings happen. It's also in the storm. It's in the locust and it's in the waiting. Whether we feel joy or pain or understanding, or even if we don't, it's still a God thing. Because we know we can trust that God is always at work. And because we know when our lives are in the hands of God, all things are a God thing. Have a closing hymn?